This video demonstrates the process of working with GitLab in Eclipse for developing Java programs and maintaining source control and source version controlling via Eclipse. Remember, version control systems are used to streamline software development by teams of developers, and they enable sharing and maintaining consistency of the source code across the team. There are several different version control systems, and in this specific presentation, we are going to focus on Git, a very popular version control system. Git was started by Linus Torvalds back in 2004, primarily for Linux kernel development and management of the kernel source code. Git uses a distributed model for version control, where each developer has their own local shared copy, which is reflected in the central repository, which is shared by many developers. Git was predominantly developed to run at the terminal by running different kinds of commands at the terminal to perform operations. However, now several companies use Git via a website or a web user interface that enables Git in the back. Examples are GitHub, which is a commonly used Git repository. There's also GitLab that can be used to develop private web-based Git repositories as well. In this video, we're going to look at GitLab, specifically the one deployed at Miami University for creating and managing projects. Here, I'm switching over in my browser to our GitLab account, which is at gitlab.csi.miamioh.edu. And notice that here, when you sign in, it'll ask you for your username and password. So once you enter your username, use your Miami University username and password and click sign in. When you log into GitLab, your initial view might look different. To start a new project, either you can click the new project button here, or you can go to the menu projects and click on creating a new project. Here I'm going to click the new project button. I'm going to create a blank project. Just going to give it some name. I'm going to call it CSE 271. Let's say I want to call it Collections Lab, just some lab. And then this is a simple Git project created for demonstration purposes and to set up a lab. Just something simple. You can typically leave all of the default settings all the same. Typically you will leave it private. I'm going to make it internal so any logged in user will be able to see this repository just for testing purposes. And then it's going to create an initial README. I'm going to click the create project button, and it takes a couple of seconds and a new project repository is created on GitLab as part of this process. So here's the new project has been created. Obviously there is an initial README file that was created for us. Here is the README file. You can look at it. And of course here there are no files yet in this, but now we have created a repository that people can use. And the key here is, of course, before we can use this repository in Git, we have to clone it. So to clone this repository, you will need the URL. So here is the URL to clone. I'm going to copy the URL into my copy it so I can use it in Eclipse. So this finishes the part of creating a repository. So creating the repository is very simple. Just fill in the web, log into GitLab CSI.miamioh.edu, give your create a new project, give the project a name, and you're done. All right, now that we have created a project, let's see how we can access and work with this Git project in Eclipse. Specifically, we're going to look at how to clone, commit, push, and pull data in Eclipse. Let's start, of course, with cloning the Git repository that we just created. So I'm going to switch over to Eclipse. In Eclipse, in order to access the repository, Git repository functions, it's easy to switch over to the Git view. So here I have the Git view. In case you don't see it, you can go through your window, perspective, open perspective, click on other, and hopefully you will see the Git perspective here, and click open. Here it switches over to your Git perspective. So here you can click on these buttons. For example, here's the button to clone a Git repository, or you can right click and choose clone a Git repository from the pop-up menu. Here when it comes, it just so happens it picked up the repository from my clipboard, but here anyways I'm going to remove it and paste the URL that I copied. So remember we went over to the GitLab git clone and copied this URL. That's the URL that I'm pasting into Eclipse here, and it'll populate rest of the stuff here. You can either enter your username and password here and store it if you want, but I'm not going to do it here. So it's going to periodically prompt me for my username and password. So here it's connecting to the remote repository. Now it asks me for my username and password, so I'm going to use my Miami University username and password. It connects. You can leave the default branches. I'm going to click next. Notice that this is the directory where all of my Git repository is going to be stored on my local machines. This is my local machine. Inside the folders Git, it's going to create this folder, and it's going to clone the project there. So I'm going to click the finish button. It'll ask me my password one more time to actually start downloading or cloning the repository. It works there, and my repository is cloned. So you can see all of the files in a repository. So for example, here's my working tree. Remember we had a default readme.md file, and this is the readme.md file. And you can see the list of logs information here. This is the one that we just created a few minutes ago. That was created, the first version of this. So you can see the logs and other information for this README. And this is how you clone a repository in Eclipse. So here's what we did. So remember, we assumed that we had a remote repository which had some versions. This is the repository we created in via GitLab. And then we made a clone which makes a local copy. So that means we used Eclipse to do the git clone. It pulled up the version and put it in our local copy. And now we can use the local copy for performing operations. So let's see how we can set up a project with this local copy that we just created via Eclipse. To create this project, I'm going to switch back to the Java perspective just because I want to create a Java project. So I'm going to go say new Java project, just the routine way of creating a Java project, nothing special here. So I'm going to give my project some kind of name. How about we say collections lab. That's just the one that I wanted to create. And notice that instead of using the default location, I'm going to browse over to the location where I created the Git repo. Notice that here it was 271 collections lab. That's the one I created. Remember, that was the original README file. That's the one that's where I want to create my project. So that way, this location will automatically be part of that Git project, and eventually when we commit and push the changes, these projects, it'll consistently work with that folder. Once you do that, click the finish button. I do not want to create modules at this time. And now the project is created. So now you can see that a new collections project has been created. Eclipse already knows that this is a Git project, so you'll see that little Git repo icon there. And of course, the README file was already there. It pulled it in. Let's go ahead and create a new Java class that we want to test. I just want to give it some name, unique values. I'm just going to give it some name. I'm going to just create a dummy Java program. It's just some starter code, right? Oh, I didn't want to create packages either. So I'm just going to go put it back in the default package. So there's that unique values there, and I'm going to delete this folder that I no longer wanted. Perfect. So I just created some starter code that I wanted to run with some to-do values. And this is how you can create that project. So remember, the key thing is when you look at the project properties, we put our project directly in the location inside the Git project so that it's easy for us to manage the files via Git as well. That's the only change that we did to create this Java project. All right, now that we've set up a Java project and we have added some code to the Java project, let's see how we can commit the code. Remember, commit basically is used to create a local version. So when we run git commit, particularly via Eclipse, it's going to merely create a local version on our computer. And keep in mind, this local version is still not reflected in the central repository or GitLab in this case. So how do we do this commit? So simply right click on the menu. You can either right click at the project level. You can right click on any of these folders. I'm going to do it at the project level because I want to commit the whole project. Notice that there's a Teams folder here. And when you do this Teams folder, you'll see a lot of Git options because Eclipse already knows all of the different, that this is managed by Git. And it will give you all of the different options from Git. So I'm going to use the commit option. Notice that's the first option there. So when you do commit, it'll start looking at all of the different files and folders that were changed. And this is we call the Git staging area. So initially we're going to stage the changes. And it's telling me all of these files are the ones that have not been committed to Git yet. So I'm going to highlight all of those files. And I'm going to drag and drop them into the changes. That means I do want to commit all of these changes. And you can add a commit message. This is an initial commit of a Java project that I am going to be working on. So it's just a commit of the Java project that I'm going to be working on. So I added a commit, and then I'm going to commit these files to create a new version or repository. So I'm going to click the commit button, and the files have been committed. So, and this is pretty much it. So for example, if you go back to this file, you can go see all of these files have been updated. So you'll see that these files are in Git now. You'll see that little Git repository icon against all of these folders. And then of course you can look at some of the repository information and such as well. You can look at the history of this file, so you can see different versions. That if I had multiple versions, you will see different versions here. And this is how you can even manage local versions. Keep in mind we have only created a local copy, so if I go back to my Git GitLab website, I refresh my files. At this stage, I will not see any of the files that have been changed because I have not pushed any of my local changes to the central repository. Yeah. So this is something that's important to keep in mind. When you commit, you create only a local version, right? This does not reflect in the shared repository. So we have created a version here. This version has not been pushed to the central repository. So that's something to keep in mind. So let's see how we can push code to the central repository. Of course, here we're going to use Eclipse to do the push. And here we're going to run a command with Eclipse via Eclipse. So it's going to push the changes to the central repository and will create a new version in the central repository. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to switch back to Eclipse. I want to do the top level. So I'm going to right click, say team. I'm going to say push to the origin, push back to the central repository. So when I do the push, this is where it's trying to send it. Notice that it's trying to send it to GitLab csmiami.edu. It requires my password to access that central repository. So I'm going to give it my username and password. And notice that here it's saying this is the initial, this is all the changes that are being pushed. So I'm going to say yes, do that, and I'm going to close it. And it does all of those changes have been committed or pushed to the central repository. So you can see that there was my initial commit to this, and then it's been pushed to the main central repository. Yeah. Now that I've pushed it to the central repository, remember here initially there was just only this readme, the MD file. Now if you refresh your view of the central repository, you should be able to see all of the other files, the Eclipse project files, the source that was edited. Remember we had this unique value source file. All of this is now visible, and other developers can now see this information in, and they can update their own local copies of the repository now. Of course, other users will have to pull the code from the central repository to update their own version. So for example, here let's say a different user wants to update their repository, they have to do git pull, and they can get the version from the central repository into their local Git repo. Of course, here we don't have much to, since there is only one user at this time, there's not much to pull, but you can always right click on this and then go back to your Teams folder and notice that there's a pull option, right? So you can click the pull option, which will then again go check. Right now, it does not know what the versions are in the repository. So first, you have to let Git access that central repository so you can find out what versions are there. It goes and checks the central repository. In this case, it says nothing to update. Everything is up to date because my local version of my files are up to date with the central repository. So there was nothing to pull from the central repository because everything is up to date. However, if there were changes, you will see the changes coming through. It'll show you what files have changed and what the changes are, and it'll make that local copy, and your local version will automatically update to the current version that you've pulled from the central repository. This is how you work with Eclipse. So once you set up the project, everything that you do in Eclipse, go to the Teams folder. You'll see commit, you'll see push, you will see pull, and these are the pretty three standard operations that you will do. Of course, more advanced versions, you can create branches and push to branches, and you can switch to different branches. So you can create a new branch and commit across branches, and all of those other kinds of operations can be done. Yeah. All right, keep in mind Git is a distributed version control system and it uses a local storage repository. So that's where all of the changes are staged. So we create our project and work with our projects in the local repository. And the local repository is updated. Either you push and pull your changes with a shared central repository. And in this case, our shared central repository came from GitLab. Git's primary purpose or design is to run at a terminal or command prompt. And of course, here we have used GitLab, which provides a web-based interface for Git. That's what the primary use that we did for GitLab. The commonly used operations that we did today are cloning and then creating a project in the clone space, then committing some of the changes to create local versions, and then pushing the changes to the central repository so other users can see your changes, and then pulling or updating our local repository from changes from the central repository. And of course, Git also permits branching and merging, but these are a little bit more sophisticated operations to be covered in a different demonstration. Hope you found this Git demonstration to be useful and helpful. Enjoy working with Git and using version control for managing your sophisticated software development processes. Good luck.